Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this Finance for Biodiversity Nature Action 100 webinar looking at the pharmaceutical and biotech sector. So we're very excited to announce the launch of our Nature Engagement Guide for investors on the pharmaceutical and biotech sector. And I'm also really pleased to have a couple of expert speakers to contribute to our webinar discussion today. Holly Metcalf and Rachel Crossley. I'll introduce them a little bit more in a moment. Just to quickly give you an idea of the agenda. So a couple of things to say by way of introduction. One is if you have any questions, then do please use the chat function. Pop your questions in there and we'll pick them up towards the end of the webinar. And the webinar will be recorded and the slides will be available subsequently. So you can sort of maybe not need to take quite so many notes as you otherwise might do. But that'll take a wee while. So if you like the immediacy, scribble away. And in terms of the agenda today, I'm delighted we're going to have WBCSD talking about the actions that biotech and pharma companies should be taking and some of the work that they've been doing with companies in the pharma sector. Then I'll run through our sector brief, explain a little bit more about it, what it actually covers, the sort of the items within it, and how it's designed to help investors with their engagement with companies in this sector. And then we're going to look at a case study, and BNP Asset Management have been doing some really interesting work with around the issue of horseshoe crabs and the bleeding said poor animals for the pharmaceutical industry, and how we can potentially switch to much more sustainable sources rather than horseshoe crabs. So Rachel Crossley will be talking about that, and we've also got a video to show you on that one as well. And then there's a bit of time for Q&A towards the end. We're trying to keep it fairly tight, so if you don't get time for your questions to be answered in the webinar, do put them in the chat anyway, and I will make sure that one of us gets back to you afterwards with an answer to your question. So without further ado, just to introduce our speakers for today. So delighted to have Holly Metcalf, who's a manager at WBCSD in charge of the Roadmaps to Nature Positive program. Rachel Crossley, who is head of stewardship Europe for BNP Paribas Asset Management. And I am Peter Elwin, and I'm the Director of Engagement and Research with Finance for Biodiversity. We are the sort of primary authors of this paper, but it's important to say we've had input from a number of people and organisations, including, of course, our partners in the Nature Action 100 series and IIGCC. So we're very grateful for their input. So what I'd like to do now is hand over to Holly and let her take the floor and talk us through what WBCSD has been doing in this area. So Holly, over to you. I'll stop sharing and you can start.
Thanks so much, Peter. Just checking everyone can hear me okay. We've got our slides. Thanks, Nesta. Appreciate it. So I just wanted to say, first of all, before going into this, that I'm really excited to be on this call today, and I was very privileged. Thank you very much, Peter, for letting me be involved in the and contributing to this report. It's a super valuable report in terms of how we can hold the pharma sector to account through investment decisions. So a great piece of work that it's very excited has come out today. For those that haven't heard of us, we are the WBCSD. It stands for the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And what we do is we work with businesses and convene stakeholders from various different organizations around the world to tackle sustainability challenges. So our work evolves around the climate space, so taking climate action, nature restoration, and also tackling inequality. I'm going to deep dive in on our work around the nature space, but also how that intersects with the pharma sector. So like Peter mentioned, I'm a manager in the Nature Action Imperative team at WBCSD. And what we work to do is with our member organisations, and many of those being in the pharma sector, is to embed nature into corporate decision-making processes. So we've got a wide range of companies across different sectors, and we carry out this work across various different work streams. And one of those is being the Roadmaps to Nature Positive, which I'll go into in a little bit more detail shortly. But before I get started, I always like to get a bit of a pulse check in the room and see, everyone's level of comfortability around the topic. I'm sure that we have a bit more of a mature audience here with us today, but I just wanted to get a sense of understanding how comfortable you feel explaining how nature is material for business. And if you're feeling in this lower 3 or 4 bracket, hopefully this is going to be somewhat helpful for you today to improve on how you can feel more confident in explaining how nature is material for business. Or if you're sitting in this 1-2 bucket, maybe it can be a refresher learning opportunity as well. So thanks for launching that poll, Peter. We'll give everyone just a couple more seconds. And maybe we can launch the results if possible. Okay, great. I don't know if everyone else can see these responses, but it's a bit of a bell curve. We've got a few people in this very comfortable bucket, in the comfortable bucket, but then we've got lots, oh, not a bell curve really, and then a lot more in the somewhat comfortable area. So hopefully this is helpful for you. I'll kind of be speeding through this at lightning speed. So what I wanted to talk a little bit about is why nature is material for business, which some of you have suggested that you feel more comfortable in explaining this. But essentially what we talk about with our members is, how nature, we viewed this as one of our most critical suppliers. And that being because over half of the global GDP is moderately or highly dependent on nature and the services it provides. So you can see in this diagram here, it provides services such as water, clean air, fertile soil, pollination, stable climates, and a really rich biodiversity. So these are all the living systems that every single business, irrespective of your sector, really depends on to function, and to varying different degrees depending where you sit along that value chain. So if that supplier falters, so does your ability to deliver real value. However, nature is very much considered an afterthought in many decision-making processes, and we still hear this a lot with companies, and that's because I suppose the space is it's still new and evolving, and it's a very complicated space as well to properly measure and track. So what we try to do is a lot of our work is around translation, so showing the likes of the procurement team or finance, operations, and leadership teams that when we talk about nature, what we're really talking about is supply risk, operational continuity, and the bottom line. So reframing nature is not just as a nice to have, but as a really indispensable supplier that if any sort of sensible company would really actively steward. So as this is not news to anyone, I suspect in this room that human activities are driving these huge environmental changes, and in doing so, we're really depleting the natural resources that we're so fundamentally reliant on to function as a global economy. And the pharma sector is no exception to this rule. As you can see in the statistic here, nearly 80% of medicines are derived from or inspired by natural products. So if ecosystems are continuing to degrade, we're really compromising our ability to innovate. So if we really want to have resilient and innovative and long-term opportunity, pharma companies, and we need to start thinking about how we can reframe our relationship with nature and integrate this into business making decisions and our business strategies. So this is what we sought to do with our roadmaps to nature positive. And we developed a roadmap to nature positive for the pharmaceutical sector. But as you can see here, this is part of a broader series that we developed across different sectors, where we brought companies together to define a shared agenda and outline credible and actionable steps. So as you can see here, there are lots of different companies involved in this process as well for the pharmaceutical roadmap. So we had the likes of AstraZeneca and Bayer. This was convened by GSK as a major funder for this report, and we worked with a range of other pharmaceutical companies that you can see here on this screen to really shape this roadmap and bring it to life. So what is involved in this roadmap when I talk about the roadmap? And I don't know if there might be some of you who I've spoken to about this in the past, but for those that haven't heard or seen this roadmap, I encourage you to read it. It's been a great resource, and it really provides the foundations for driving nature action in the pharmaceutical sector. I'll share the link with everyone after as well if you didn't get the chance to scan the QR code. So what we did in this report is we began by defining the key stages of the pharmaceutical value chain as that first step. So we could identify then after that where the most material dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities lie across the value chain and where they intersect on the value chain. So once we had this sort of foundation, what we could do is then develop targeted actions that directly address nature issues and support companies working towards nature positive outcomes. So what we did is the results sort of look like this. So this is the value chain map that we came to consensus on, and I won't go too much into the methodology here. This is outlined in the roadmap report, and I'm happy to chat about it at another time. But what we did is we mapped the full value chain. We looked at from the raw material inputs to research and development, manufacturing, packaging, and then delivery systems and end of life. So really covering that full spectrum of the pharmaceutical value chain. And so once we had this established, it became really clear then, and we could look at, okay, where are those nature-related dependencies along this value chain that the pharma sector is reliant on to operate? So we identified these top 5 dependencies, conscious that there's many more out there, but these were sort of identified as the top 5 most material dependencies for the pharmaceutical sector that depend on these ecosystems and as assets to operate. So you can see here we have water supply, water purification, climate regulation, research and use of genetic material, and bio-based products. And then what we did was from here, this we also need to consider the different types of, just trying to flick through, the different types of impacts as well that the sector has on nature along its full value chain too. So again, there are many more impacts across the full value chain, but based on consensus with our group and the methodology that we applied, we landed on these top 5 impacts being the GHG emissions involved, land use change from your operations, etc., solid waste, water use, and water pollution as those most impact area, those highest impact areas on nature. So now we've got the value chain defined. We can see where the dependencies and impacts lie across this value chain, but what we can't talk, these dependencies and impacts, they're not just going to sit in a sustainability report. There's massive risks that sit behind this as well, and that create real risks for pharmaceutical companies that we also need to talk about. So these are just some of the examples of the risks that we identified through inaction on nature. So for example, water scarcity. This is a big topic that's coming up time and time and again, and the more frequent and severe it becomes, the higher your operating costs become, because the water that you're relying on simply isn't there in the same way that it used to be. And then on the transition side, we're seeing companies are facing growing due diligence and reporting requirements to comply with new nature-related regulations as well. So everything from land use rules to deforestation-linked disclosures. So this means that companies really need to start directing their attention to meet these new expectations, also from an investment perspective as well. Otherwise, they're going to be subject to penalties, the likes of reputational risk, and lose out on competitiveness. However, in the same vein, though, this also creates opportunities, and I think that this is something that we don't talk enough about as well, is what are those realized opportunities that come through investment into nature? And those opportunities are really valuable. So, for example, again, this is just a snapshot of some of the opportunities we talk about in the roadmap, but when ecosystems are healthy, supplies benefit from more predictable agricultural and production conditions as well, which can reduce costs and improve product quality. And when suppliers adopt regenerative agriculture or other nature positive practices, you build a supply chain that's much more resilient, more stable, and better able and more equipped to absorb shocks as well. So this is what is required, not just at an individual business level, but as a sector-wide level, through driving or focusing efforts around nature, we can have these types of opportunities that can be realized.
Give you a 5-minute warning, Holly.
Okay, great. Thanks, Peter. Awesome. So from this then, we have a much clearer understanding of your impacts or the pharmaceuticals dependencies and impacts on nature, what those types of risks and opportunities are. And so this comes to, I would argue, the most important piece of the puzzle is, okay, so how are we going to create really impactful and tangible action on nature to directly address and mitigate those impacts on nature and manage our dependencies in a sustainable way? So at a very high level, these are the top 5 actions we identified. There's a much broader suite that sits in this roadmap report that's mapped across the full value chain. So I encourage you to go take a look. There's the QR code again to the report is in this slide. So we looked at, for example, responsible sourcing, managing water use, avoiding reducing release of GHG emissions, reducing pollution risk from APIs, and reducing solid waste across the value chain were the top sort of 5 areas that we identified. So now we've got the foundations. What we did over the course of last year is talk a little bit about measurement and sort of delve into this territory a bit more, because this is something that we've heard from members they're really grappling with. There's 1,000 different ways to measure nature. So how can we be really impactful and strategic when it comes to those metrics that we're looking at and reporting on in our disclosures? So but this here, I've just sort of given a bit of a highlight onto why we focused on this, but what I really wanted to emphasize here is the importance of nature metrics, and this is why we really focused on this as the second step of the process last year, because with credible and feasible and relevant metrics, what we're able to do is provide companies with the confidence to then set ambitious targets, because they've got clarity on how to measure and disclose the progress they've taken on actions. And then you can also use this as a filter to source what is the most appropriate data that you need to inform your decision making and allocate your resources accordingly. So you might have seen, or you might not have, and if you haven't, again, another QR code, but this is a really valuable resource. It is designed for sustainability practitioners working within, different sectors, including the pharmaceutical sector. But another great user of this is, for example, investors, where you can go in and you can look at the types of metrics that companies should be focusing on to drive and nature action in their operations, but also in their value chain. So at a very high level, just to talk about what this portal is essentially you can go in as a user, you can identify the sector that you want to focus on, and then within the sector, then you're able to go in. It's got all the resources from the roadmap reports that we did at the different sector levels. So for example, for the pharmaceutical level, you can go in, look at your dependencies and impacts, risks, and opportunities to help inform the actions that you want to take, and you select the actions that you would like to prioritize. And then from here, it's going to bring out a range of different metrics from existing frameworks and guidance that are most relevant and feasible to drive nature positive outcomes in your operations and value chains. I just want to do a quick time check. I might be over, so I think I might leave it
Got about
there.
1 minute left, Holly. So yeah,
1 minute.
Summary and wrap up.
All right. Well, what I wanted to introduce you to is the work that we're going to be doing this year. So last year was very focused, or the previous 2 years was focused on action and metrics, and now what we're doing is we're focusing on measurement. So we announced at the end of last year, we're going to be working with the Nature Positive Initiative and a range of really key partners in this space to develop a globally accepted approach to nature measurement, including standardized methodologies for using nature-related metrics as well. So this will be similar to the role that the GHG protocol has played in the climate space, and we're looking to sort of plug that real gap that we're hearing from a lot of companies when it comes to nature measurement. It's a very confusing and overwhelming space to go into. So this is what we're trying to, I guess, now achieve with the protocol this year. So I have a few resource slides. I'll share this with you later. We'll send a follow-up. I'm sure Peter will share these slides with the group after. But this is a bit of a snapshot of what we are going to be working on this year. And I think it's really valuable from an investor perspective as well. These types of tools can really support, for example, risk assessments and highlighting what are those nature material impacts and dependencies that you should be looking at when working with pharmaceutical companies. So hopefully that has given you a bit of a flavour of things. I know I've raced through that and I won't eat up any more of anyone else's time, but thank you for having me on. I'll be in the background for questions.
Thank you so much, Holly. Yeah, please do hang around. And if you do have questions for Holly or any of the sort of questions arising out of her presentation, pop them in the chat, as I said earlier, and we'd be happy to take them now or take them offline later. And we will be circulating the information, including all the extra slides that Holly didn't have time to get through. But certainly that nature portal is well worth a look, really useful resource. So what I'd like to do now, selfishly, is take the opportunity to just talk you through our new sector brief and give you a bit of an idea of what's in it. So the objective of this sector brief, and indeed the other 4 that we're also producing, is to support Nature Action 100 investors and indeed members of Finance for Biodiversity Foundation when they are engaging with companies around their sort of nature impacts and dependencies and the risks and opportunities, as Holly was outlining in terms of this particular sector, the biotech and pharma sector. And what our report does, it very much builds on the work of WBCSD, as well as a number of other organizations. So it summarizes the nature impacts and dependencies, sets out sort of key actions that investors should expect companies to take with a view to the company's maturity. And I'll talk a bit more about that again in a minute. It sets out some questions which you can use in sort of due diligence prior to meetings, or also in the actual engagement process itself, and it also provides a useful sort of summary of a number of key investors, key resources which investors can find very useful. As I say, it's the first of 5, so it will be followed fairly swiftly by chemicals, forestry, paper and packaging, food and agri, and then wrapping up with metals and mining. And the aim is to get all of that done sort of in this first half of the year. So a busy period. You saw a chart that looked pretty like this. We stole this from WBCSD because it's an excellent way of summarizing the value chain. And as those of you who sort of engaged with this sector will know, the value chain is extremely complicated. And as Holly was alluding to, it obviously has downstream impacts in terms of post-production and the whole issue around end of life and circularity and the extent to which that's even possible with some pharmaceutical products. And clearly there's a whole variety of products within that value stream. We're going to be talking about one of those a little bit later when Rachel is presenting on horseshoe crabs, which is very, very much a nature-based product, at least in terms of some companies, but with an entirely sort of non-nature-based substitute. And clearly you need to think about the direct operations of pharmaceutical companies, but also I think particularly in this sector, very important to think about both upstream and downstream. And so our report helps to really sort of focus on that. And then as again, something was sort of being mentioned, things like antimicrobial resistance, which is perhaps not necessarily a direct responsibility of the pharmaceutical sector, but is clearly a massive issue in terms of how their products are being used. And again, is something that a number of investors have been looking at quite closely, particularly through organizations like the FAIR initiative. So we've summarized the material impacts. Holly's sort of talked through those, so I won't really sort of go through them in any more detail. We've also made strong reference to Encore, which again WBCSD did as well in their report. Encore is a database which sets out the impacts and dependencies of different sectors and subsectors of the economy and scales them from very low to very high. Those scales between different impacts and dependencies, they're not sort of relative to each other. So it's a very high in one score is not necessarily comparable to a very high in another, but it's a good indication of where to look and where to direct questions when talking to a company in a particular part of the value chain. Now, again, WBCSD report has an absolutely fantastic sort of heat map giving a lot of detail. We've replicated in our report, but you can read all the detail in theirs, and it gives you a very clear sense as to where the sort of the hotspots are in terms of impacts, and also in terms of dependencies. And again, Holly was sort of summarizing those, so I won't really talk through them, but there are some really obviously key ones for this particular sector, a lot of them relating to water, of course. And you'll probably have seen some headlines recently about sort of growing desertification challenges in a number of countries around the world. So this is likely to be a very, very significant issue, certainly over the next 10 years, and unfortunately for a number of countries over the next sort of few years, in the near term rather than the long term. So again, brilliant heat map showing the dependencies of the different parts of the value chain, and also giving some very clear guidance if you're looking at a particular product line, whether it's coming from sort of an agricultural base or a petrochemical base or wherever. It gives you a sense as to where to look for the challenges and the problems and the opportunities as well when you're in discussions with a company. One of the other things that we touch on in our report, which is something that the TNFD has been very focused on, this whole concept of LEAP, locate, evaluate, assess, and prepare the direction for companies when they're really beginning to dig into their nature impacts and dependencies. And a core part of that is, well, sort of how much does the actual location matter? Is the location a priority location? It's material because the organization has material nature-related impacts, dependencies, risks, and opportunities, and/or it's actually intrinsically sensitive. So the area itself is actually ecologically important. So the Amazon would be a very obvious example, but there are many, many other places around the world where they are particularly sensitive from an ecological perspective. And actually, Rachel's horseshoe crab example is probably another good example of a species which is very, very sort of location specific, and therefore that location is highly sensitive. Now, one of the frameworks that has been sort of broadly agreed across the business community, and therefore I think it's really useful for investors to be talking the same language, is the ACT-D framework. Again, guidance for companies primarily when they're sort of getting stuck into their nature journey, to assess using the LEAP process, to commit to actually taking action, and then to go on that transformational journey. And then, of course, ultimately, from an investor perspective, this is really important to actually disclose what you're doing in a credible, consistent, comparable way, so that we can make assessments between companies and across time. Now, the expectations that we've set out in our report obviously draw very heavily from WBCSD and a number of other sources. What we've also tried to do is to give some guidance as to the extent to which those actions might be considered both feasible from sort of cost perspective and a technological perspective, and also the extent to which they might be considered beneficial in terms of reducing impacts on nature. So we've tried to create a bit more of a matrix around that, and then also take into account the company's maturity. Again, there's absolutely no point in asking a company which is very early on its journey or is really sort of rather strapped for resources to do some very ambitious things from a nature perspective, when really what you would actually want them to start doing is some much more basic things. So taking account of the maturity of the company, both its operations and its sort of management capacity, its management knowledge, is pretty important when you're engaging. So you want your targets to the company, your asks on the company to be stretching, but not sort of unachievable, fairly obviously. Now, the recommended company actions, again, drawing and sort of echoing what's in the WBCSD report. They've got sort of 5 priority actions. We've actually broken it down into 7, but it covers very similar sort of a set of areas. And you can assess the actions that a company is taking against the ones that are actually listed in the sector brief. So the actions provide a sort of a checklist at the start that you can use as a reference point. And then, crucially, we've built a whole load of engagement questions that you can use, modify, sort of structure as you wish. These are organized along the lines of the Nature Action 100 investor expectations. So if you're already using that framework in your engagement, if you're in one of the Nature Action 100 engagement teams, then this will be structured in a way which is hopefully sort of familiar and accessible, and will allow you to pick out the questions that you really want to focus on at a particular point in the engagement process. They're designed to be useful both pre-meeting, when you're in the sort of due diligence phase, and also during the actual engagement process, whether it be meetings, email exchanges, and the like. So we've separated the questions into questions that can generally more likely be answered by looking at company filings, although you may still want to discuss them with individuals at the company. And then other questions which are more likely to be answered through email exchanges or in person in meetings, where the filings that the company has published may not be sufficient to really give you the sort of the depth and the nuance that you're looking for. We've divided the questions into sector specific and general. Most of them are sector specific. There are some sort of cross-cutting questions which we felt would be useful to include in this sector brief. If you look at other sectors and our other sector briefs, you'll see those questions popping up again, really just to make sure you've got all the questions in one place rather than skipping between documents. But the majority of the questions will focus on the pharmaceutical and biotech sector. A lot of them are open-ended, seeking to really draw out information, but some of them can be sort of taken on a more sort of binary basis, and therefore could be used if you wanted to construct a due diligence questionnaire, or indeed some sort of internal scoring system. You could use some of these questions as the basis for that, and then a lot more will be for meeting preparation and follow-up. And then finally, the other point in our brief is a section on supporting resources, where we've got further information about the transformation of the sector. A whole variety of organisations, obviously including WBCSD, but not just them alone, have published very important reports on this, so you can do further digging there. It summarises some of the collaborative engagements that are currently going on in relation to the pharmaceutical and biotech sectors, and also gives you information about sustainability initiatives, which are often being sort of populated by the companies themselves, or sort of pressed by other non-profit organisations. And then finally, a brief summary on data as well. So lots of information in there. We'd love your feedback. We definitely don't think this is the sort of the full answer. We hope it's a really useful tool, and it's something that we would obviously be looking to sort of improve over the coming sort of years through dialogue with investors. So do take a look at it, use it, come back to us, tell us what can be improved. That would be absolutely fantastic. What I'd like to do now is hand over to Rachel, but before I actually do that, I would also like to play a video. So let me do that first. And this video is all about the campaign that
contains an immensely valuable resource to us humans and our health. But it doesn't come without an enormous cost. A chain of events in nature with dire consequences. Welcome to the ripple effect. This is a red knot. It weighs 100 grams. And this is how far it travels in a single year. 100 grams, 30,000 kilometers. The secret to this bird's success comes from the eggs of an unusual animal in an unlikely place. The horseshoe crab in the Delaware Bay, where the red knot stopped to refuel during their migration north. By the end of their stay, they've doubled, sometimes tripled their weight, a vital step to survive their epic journey.
female crab will come ashore, lay clusters of eggs. Red knots come to Delaware Bay, feed on the eggs of horseshoe crabs. Those eggs will also hatch, and the young will feed, other species. It's called a keystone species. Like, if you take it out of an ecosystem, then the ecosystem essentially collapses.
But today, the horseshoe crab is declining. The reason? Well, it turns out another species has become increasingly dependent on it for its own survival. But it's not the crab's eggs they're after. It's their electric blue blood. Specialized labs collect horseshoe crab blood in bottles in long and streamlined rows. Why? Because of limulus amoebocyte lysate, a unique substance in the crab's blood. It's the primary way we test vaccines, needles, and many other medical tools for contamination. It's very likely this $15,000 jar of blue blood has helped you. The problem? Our healthcare system is dependent on a species of animal that's vital to its ecosystem and in rapid decline. But there is a way to reverse this trend that benefits everyone: the red knots, the crabs, and us. Several synthetic equivalents to the crab's blood do exist. They are just as good, if not better, and widely accepted by regulators. A new challenge arises, making these equivalents a norm, so the crabs and their ecosystem are no longer affected. Enter BNP Paribas Asset Management.
When the next pandemic arrives, and we know it will, and endotoxin testing demand spikes, will you be ready? That's one of the key questions that we're asking companies.
Here's what the team did to change the status quo.
We brought the issue to a group called the Pharmaceutical Supply Chain Initiative. They then formed an industry working group, and that industry working group published a position paper on best practices for use of horseshoe crabs in the pharmaceutical sector. This allowed us to go back to companies and to say, this is not just our opinion. Here is a set of best practices that were developed by your peers, and we'd like to know how you're responding to this. We've gotten better responses from companies since that paper came out.
This type of work is what Adam, Rachel, and the rest of the team do every day.
Our role in the stewardship team is to step in after the investment decisions have been made, to monitor companies in our portfolios, and particularly to focus on their impact to society and the environment, and of course, how that might impact portfolio returns.
By modifying the way we produce vaccines, we are preserving a vital ecosystem. A small action can start a chain of events that, like a ripple effect, can have a profound impact.
Fantastic. Rachel, follow that.
Essentially for 5 years now, we've been doing this engagement on this extraordinary dependency that we stumbled across in this sector of all endotoxin testing for anything that goes into your body, injectables, medical devices, and then lab water, adjuvants, other equipment in the labs having to be tested for endotoxins. And that testing having been done for decades now using the blood of horseshoe crabs that are endangered, at least species in Asia are endangered, and the main population in the northeast of the US is threatened according to IUCN. So just in case, it all went too quickly and you didn't have the audio, that's the snapshot of it. So we've been doing a lot of engagement with the US and European companies on this. So Adam, that you saw in the video, is head of stewardship for Europe, for the Americas, and I'm head of stewardship for Europe at BNP Paribas Asset Management. So given that hopefully most of the story was, within that video, Peter asked me to reflect on sort of lessons learned from it. I guess I was going to sort of add in there some success factors, as in the sort of things that I think we're lucky enough to have at BNP Paribas Asset Management that meant that we could actually do that engagement, as well as then some lessons learned. So I think that the main, most important thing is that as a business, as an investment management firm, we have got a commitment to addressing long-term systemic risks, and nature loss is one of them. Our three big themes are the same as WBCSDs, not surprisingly: climate, nature loss, and inequality. So this means that as a stewardship team, we can dedicate quite a lot of time to tackling these long-term systemic risks. So in relation to nature, that's meant that my colleague Adam, for example, helped design and set up Nature Action 100. So we're able to get involved in sort of creating big, impactful investor organizations, but it also means we can dedicate a lot of time to these bilateral engagements. And as heads of our respective regions, we also have quite a lot of autonomy. We don't have to present plans and get approvals for things. We can just go ahead and do it. So that's pretty useful. And the systemic stewardship approach that we take also means that we really look for these system-wide solutions. So we're not constrained to just having to do sort of company by company engagement. But we also try to link it to public policy engagement. We try to present to industry associations. We're looking for these sort of roadblocks to industry progress and thinking about how we, working with other stakeholders, can help to overcome them. And in this area, you know, the pharmacopoeias and the regulators, you know, essentially, you know, they need to change their guidance for the companies on how to do this kinds of testing, which unlocks everything. And so we've been trying to understand where each regulator and pharmacopoeia is, and whether there's anything again that we could do to help advocate for them to support the use or the switch from horseshoe crab blood across to synthetics. So what lessons have we learned? Given that, you know, we've got a great setup, but it took a lot of time. This is a very, very, very technical issue. You really need to be a microbiologist. We often have that problem, don't we, in our roles, that we end up working on such technical issues. You have to be a jack of all trades, and that can be pretty difficult when you don't have a scientific background, potentially, like me. And I mean, I don't have a scientific background, and then you're trying to get your head around things like microbiology and endotoxin testing. So that takes, you know, the willingness to spend the time, speak to lots of experts, try and get your head around it. We had to be very determined and be committed to this in the long haul. So we've been doing this 5 years now. And you just have to keep going back and back and back, as a lot of you will know, in your engagements, even when you're a buff to start with, to get some traction and to start to make some progress. So we've had multiple contacts with a lot of companies year in, year out. And we've been trying to balance our engagement with asking companies to take particular steps, which, if you saw in the video, the PSCI, the Pharmaceutical Supply Chain Initiative, had come up with some best practices working with their members, and we initiated that work. And so we've been asking companies to tell us, you know, how far along they are in taking those particular steps, show us that they've got plans, they've got targets, even if they're not publishing them, which they're reluctant to do. And so we do those kinds of engagements, but then also try to feedback kind of what we're hearing in an anonymized way, summarizing all kind of the best practices and the kind of leading examples we find to encourage all the other companies and spur a little bit of sort of healthy competition between them. So we're aiming to become seen as a valuable partner by companies on this. So not just a pesky investor who's sort of, you know, keeps demanding lots of things of them, but try to have them see us as a partner that can help overcome some of the roadblocks they're facing. The other things that have been really important are building trust with some of the key NGOs and scientists, so that we can go back to them and ask all of the, you know, the questions when we keep coming up against things we don't understand. And then they provide valuable insights to us, but also start to, you know, ask us to speak at events, and they might alert us to key developments, opportunities to support regulatory, you know, change, etc. So that's a really good two-way street. Communicate was my next point. Just keep communicating with the companies, keep this issue front and center, also by speaking at industry association events and things like that. And we were very lucky that our comms team wanted to make the video that you just saw, you know, which hopefully also gets the message out to a much wider audience. And what we're hoping to do now is to leverage these relationships that we've built with the companies on this particular issue to start to address, you know, all the wider issues, the biodiversity issues that you've been hearing about from Holly and Peter that they've mapped out so well in their guides and the programs that they run. So with that, I'll leave it there. Peter, back to you for questions, I think.
Thanks very much indeed, Rachel. Yeah, that's really helpful. And apologies, everyone, for my technical ineptitude. I realised there was a button I should have clicked which says share with sound. So lesson learned. When we post the recording, I'll see if we can do some post-production editing to make the whole thing appear much more smooth. And of course, I'll then cut out all my errors. In terms of questions, one quick question actually, which is specifically for you, Rachel, which is, and it was a funny enough question I was thinking about as well before this, why pharmaceutical companies keep using horseshoe crab's blood instead of the synthetic options. What are the advantages of continuing to use natural product? Why don't they automatically switch to synthetic?
Yep, we've been told just there's huge inertia and conservatism in the industry. Look, we've always done it this way. It's always worked. You know, it's a pain in the neck to change. Why should we? Particularly if, you know, a lot of the people that are running those tests are not aware of, you know, the nature impact. So that's been one big barrier. Another big one, though, is, as I said, the guidance, no, stronger than that, the absolute regulatory requirements for the industry as to how they have to test are set by national or like a European pharmacopoeia or the regulators, the pharmaceutical sector regulators. And for a long time, it was only January 2025 that the US pharmacopoeia, for example, updated its guidance and said that companies were able to use one of the synthetic alternatives. And that had been a massive block for US companies. So Eli Lilly has been an absolute pioneer in this, and it's their sort of lead microbiologist who's spearheaded all of this work. You know, like he's just been incredible for years and years and years, an absolute pioneer. So he found a way to do it out with the pharmacopoeia guidance by going, I think, to the FDA. And there are routes to do it, but you have to be incredibly dedicated. And it just so happens that he's a bird watcher. He knew about the red knots declining. He understood then that was because the horseshoe crab populations were declining, and he realized that he could sort of bring his personal passion and his professional work together and sort of solve this big problem. So the European Pharmacopoeia has also just approved or recently approved or made more explicit that companies can use one of the two synthetic alternatives. So that has mainly been the barriers, but it's mostly been, I think, lack of understanding of this absolute, you know, how acute or extreme this dependency is. To think that all of your testing of all of your vaccines and your injectables and your medical devices depend on one species, you know, and there's only 3 types in the world, and the 2 in Asia are endangered and 1 is threatened. I mean, I don't think we're probably likely to come across any other, you know, extreme dependency like that in any sector. So I think it took a while for that message to kind of filter through and go, oh my goodness, okay, you know, we really need to diversify our risk basically and start to move to other synthetic alternatives.
That's really helpful. And when you frame it like that as a sort of industry-ending dependency, it's really a bit surprising that we haven't actually got there a lot quicker. And in fact, that we're not there 100% now. But
exactly. Yes.
But yeah, fantastic example. Thank you so much, Rachel. There was one other question that I just wanted to throw in before we close, really to both of you, and maybe Holly, I can perhaps start with you. Obviously, when managements are thinking about sort of analysing their nature risks and dependencies, and also potentially thinking about opportunities and the risks, what do you, from a sort of WBCSD perspective, do you have any sort of brief thoughts on what indicators you would look for to understand that the management is actually taking a sort of disciplined long-term capital allocation approach to these decisions and appropriately balancing trade-offs as well? What indicates that level of sort of what I might call management maturity in your view?
Yes, that's a great question, Peter. I think we work with companies across a whole different range of maturity levels within the nature action imperative, and we see all different types of levels of maturity. And I think the companies that we would consider as sort of more leaders in this space, not just for the pharmaceutical sector, but more broadly, and what we try and really, it's part of our mission, as part of the nature action imperative, is embedding nature into corporate decision-making processes. And by what I mean by that is it's not just, siloing nature in the conversation in the sustainability function with an organization, but actually, making that a really sort of vertical conversation within your organization. So making sure that this is in the front of mind for your procurement teams when they're going out to their suppliers, and that they're considering nature-based risks in their assessment processes. Finance and the risk team, the leadership team, as well as a massive one, the buy-in is so important to really make sure that that's considered in your business strategy, not just within your sustainability report. That's what we consider very much sort of best practice at a broad level. And then I think at a more technical level, some of those types of indicators, I would say, as well as, companies having those really clear and time-bound nature targets that are aligned with existing global frameworks and bonus points for alignment with SBTN, which is really, really challenging. So that's sort of, your North Star, if that's the right word. But to get there, there's so many processes, which is what I was sort of talking about, is you need to understand what your impacts and dependencies are so you can make really impactful actions. And then, you need your actions to then be like, okay, well, these are the types of metrics we should adopt. But then it's a question of how do you measure those metrics? Do we have the right data? Do we have the availability and access to that data? And then from there, then you're in a position to be able to set those really sort of ambitious and credible targets. But to get there, there's a lot of steps and there's a lot of barriers that are currently at play, and that's what we're trying to really tackle in the work that we're doing. But an evolving space. But yes, if that's a very long answer, short is strong targets, but also integration throughout a business, not just within the sustainability function.
Yeah, thank you. That's so important, isn't it? It's a sort of business which is actually sort of where sustainability and focus on nature is, it's like the stick of rock. It's right the way through the whole business, all the way through the operations. Rachel, actually, as you might want to sort of try answering that question, but another one has actually come in on the chat, which I don't know whether, or you potentially can't see. It says, what does a successful engagement look like if a company has published a TNFD report with all the required disclosures, targets, etc.? Is that considered a success? Should we therefore stop considering the company as high risk as it has identified its risks, opportunities, and is taking action? So what's your view on that? Do you sort of stop chasing the leaders and just focus on the laggards, or how do you work out when an engagement is sort of successful, or is it a never-ending process?
Yeah, I mean, broadly, we would stop chasing leaders at a certain point. We continue to have some conversations with leaders nearly selfishly, so that we learn and we know how they've got to, the leading position and what that takes. But then, yes, we definitely then try and switch quite a lot of focus on laggards. All of us, there's way more work that we could possibly do, with the relatively small stewardship teams that we are. So yeah, I mean, there's so many companies that are so far away, aren't there, from having completed a LEAP assessment or getting anywhere near a TNFD report. So I think, yeah, oftentimes.
Maybe I can jump in on the
back. There's a lot of leaders in your group, I think.
Yeah, because we have found that issue as well. It's like, okay, what's our next course of action? And it's something where the goalpost is always moving, and that is the best case scenario. Ultimately, our jobs are actually made redundant because everyone has fully integrated into this organization and we're no longer needed. But I think one of those important things that you mentioned, Rachel, as well, is also the ability for, we like to bring in these companies that are more leading in the space to then share their experiences with other companies so that they can also communicate the shared challenges as well, and make these things feel a bit more accessible and feasible for other companies, and they can use that as learning opportunities. But the other one also is scalability as well. We really encourage, I think a lot of the frameworks and guidances out there, is taking a landscape level approach as that first step in towards, tackling and managing your nature dependencies or your impacts. And from there, you've got your, robust target, but then there's just so much, especially in the nature space. There's a gazillion different ways you can measure your impact on nature. So how do you then scale that across your whole organization? And I don't know if we've seen a company quite do that yet. I think it's a very evolving space. So there's always more that can be done. But again, you've got to really prioritize on what efforts, where you're going to get the best sort of, where there's the biggest issues at this point in time, and then go from there.
Thank you. That's, I think, very, very sort of good, comprehensive answers. I think from a Finance for Biodiversity perspective, our experience with our members is that investors themselves need to set targets in terms of what they want to achieve with their engagements. And then to an extent, you can use that and say, right, well, we wanted the company to do this. It has done it. There's 3 other companies in our portfolio that haven't, so we'll switch attention to them. And then maybe we'll come back with a new set of asks. As Holly was sort of alluding to, there's always more. We can always improve. But definitely allocating your time and your resources as an investor is clearly very important. So clear targets, clear benchmarks that you yourself are sort of aiming for is always a really important part of the engagement process, I think. We're up against the clock, so need to draw things to a halt. If you do have further questions, please feel free to get in touch with me. If the questions for Holly and or Rachel, then obviously I can direct the questions on. You'll be able to access the sector brief on our website, and we'll certainly send around the details to everybody who's attended this webinar. But just remains to me to say huge thank you to Holly and to Rachel for their contribution, and particularly to WBCSD for that fantastic report and the Nature Action portal, and Rachel for that video. Just a shame that we saw so much of Adam, Rachel, and not so much of you, but never mind. We couldn't hear the sound anyway, so it didn't really matter. But thank you very much, everybody, and have a great rest of the afternoon.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Peter. Cheers. Bye, everyone.